because there is a creek that takes them to island. This anthropologist spends an entire year studying this transient bishop of Congo, who doesn't stay on island throughout the year. They access the island year after year during October onwards. They establish transitory fishing camps, and in those years, they used to be penalized by forest department. So forest department used to give them the permit. They used to take measurement of the boats, and they issued this permit, and these people had record of those permits as well. Correct? But in the year 2002, when the Ministry of Environment and Forest, under the directions, went ahead evicting people who ministry believed were encroachers of forest. Although year after year they have issued those permits, the same West Bengal Forest Department can issue the permits. And so traditionally established access rights, even when the documentation is involved, has not been upheld. And that's a sad part. And I think the Supreme Court has erred very drastically, because Rai Chaudhary's book was published by the Council of India. Thanks to this debate, it got some reprint. The second reprint came once the court was adjudicating this dispute. And the conservation lobby was arguing that, and again, the corporate interests on the forest land, the traditionally established access rights and people's livelihood, they are juxtaposed in such a big battle that Sahara gets to claim 700 acres of the land in Sundarban Island Delta to develop ecotourism. And what kind of ecologically sensitive tourism that would be is anyone's guess. But this traditional transient bishop of Congo has been so well documented in academic literature. And the book actually goes on the deposition in Supreme Court case files. So what do our courts, when upholding constitutional rights, do about the academic knowledge that emerges from academia is something that we need to ponder upon. Given all these examples, what happened in the case of Nandao Chawandar versus Union of India, and how that majority judgment was written, and the silver line in the dark clouds was the minority judgment. And I would appeal all of you sitting here to read the minority judgment written by S.P. Bharucha, who believed otherwise, but who was a minority judge on the 3-judge panel. So people tend to go ahead with what wisdom majority judgment. And back then, when I was a student, I was reading majority judgment, and the lack of logic, the lack of legal logic, the lack of persuasiveness, that majority judgment looks like an essay written in the praise of last times. To be very honest with you, and that was the push that made me leave the academic campus behind and come and work with Nandao Chawandar.
Thank you, sir. I think that's an interesting point that you mentioned how certain mining practices are left outside the mainstream community. To come to Shikra, ma'am, you have worked extensively with gender and agriculture and activism. And considering how we know in India and particularly in the broader South Asian context, women lack formal ownership of land. Women lack control over their land. In that regard, how do you firstly look at the formal tenure rights in women and gender? And also, can you extend this discussion to customary land rights as well?
तो मेरा जवाब हिंदी में दूँगी, आप इसको ट्रांसलेट करके
Sure.
So मुझे लगता है कि जहाँ औरतों के पास ज़मीन के ऊपर लिखा हुआ अधिकार नहीं होता, वहाँ उनको कई जगह दूसरे तरीकों से एक्सेस प्राप्त होता है. कई बार ये रिलेशनल तौर पे होता है कि पति की संपत्ति है तो मिलेगा, या पिता की संपत्ति है तो रहने का हक है, इस तरह की चीज़. और दूसरे कॉन्टेक्स्ट में कई बार खाली यूज़र राइट्स होते हैं, जिसको कि हम ज़्यादातर फॉरेस्ट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखते हैं. कॉमन्स पर एक्सेस की बात होती है, टोटल यूसेज पे. कई बार सीजनल एक्सेस होती है. कई बार कुछ कस्टमरी लॉज में ऐसा भी है कुछ प्राइवेट कम्युनिटीज में कि ओवरऑल सिस्टम तो बहुत पेट्रिलिनियर है कि ज़मीन जो है पिता से पुत्र को ही जाएगी, लेकिन परिवार में, जिस परिवार में लड़की पैदा हुई है, वहाँ पर एक छोटा सा जमीन का टुकड़ा उसके लिए सुरक्षित रहेगा कि उसको कभी ज़रूरत हो तो वो वहाँ पे आके रह सके। पर ओवर टाइम इस तरह की प्रथाएँ, इस तरह के कस्टम्स एकदम खत्म हो गए हैं। पर जो चीज़ जब कस्टमरी लॉ की और औरतों के पास अधिकार नहीं होने की बात करते हैं, तो मुझे लगता है कि जो मैंने झारखंड में खास करके ट्राइबल कम्युनिटीज के साथ देखा, वो ये देखा कि उनको कस्टमरी लॉ रेजिडेंस का राइट, मेंटेनेंस का राइट देता है। और मैंने ये देखा कि समाज ये मानता है कि औरत को तो रहना, खाना, मेंटेनेंस मिल रहा है, तो उसे और क्या चाहिए। लेकिन मैंने ये देखा कि ये कैसे ज़्यादा खतरनाक है औरतों के लिए। ज़्यादा खतरनाक ऐसे है कि कस्टमरी लॉ औरत के नाम पर ज़मीन आ ही नहीं सकती, उसको अधिकार मानते नहीं। तो अगर, और स्पेशली फॉर सिंगल वुमेन, फॉर एग्जाम्पल किसी महिला के पति की डेथ हो गई, तो अभी उसको ज़मीन का किसी भी प्रकार अधिकार नहीं मिल सकता। वो खाली जब तक जीवित है वो वहाँ रह सकती है, खा सकती है। तब होता क्या है, इन इफेक्ट होता ये है कि ज़मीन का अधिकार परिवार में किसी मेल को मिल जाएगा। अगर उस महिला का बेटा है जो माइनर है, उसको मेजर हो जाएगा, तब उसको मिलेगा। या फिर उसके परिवार में देवर या जेठ या फिर किसी और रिलेशन में उनके लड़के, उसको मिलेगा। पर ये चीज़ खतरनाक इसलिए है क्योंकि क्या होता है कि मैं मेरी वोकैबुलरी में उन पुरुषों को ओनर्स इन वेटिंग कहती हूँ कि जब ये महिला रास्ते से हटेगी तब हमें इस ज़मीन का पूरा अधिकार मिलेगा। तब होता क्या है कि वो चाहते हैं कि ये औरत किसी भी तरह मेरे रास्ते से हटे, क्योंकि वो जब तक जिंदा है और वहाँ रह रही है तब तक तो उसको रहने खाने का हक कस्टमरी है। लेकिन द मोमेंट शी रीमैरिज या फिर वो वहाँ से छोड़ के चली गई, उसने 1 साल वहाँ नहीं रही, खेती नहीं करी, शी लूजेज एज ए रिजल्ट। जो पूरा सिस्टम है, स्पेशली दीज मैन और परिवार की महिलाएं भी कई बार उसमें शामिल होती हैं, उस महिला के ऊपर हर प्रकार की वायलेंस है, and which very often I have seen resulting into witchcrafting, witch hunting, and all of this happens because the community believes that there is something called spirits, जो कि एक माने spirit होती है, and if there is a spirit it deserves all kinds of things. तो मैं करीब 5 साल पहले से मैंने झारखंड जाना शुरू किया था, और इसीलिए जाना शुरू किया था कि वहाँ के कुछ महिला संगठन उनसे मिले और उन्होंने बोला कि हम जब महिलाओं के साथ काम करते हैं, ये कई महिलाओं के साथ खास करके, तो हम बहुत बार जब हिंसा की घटनाओं को सुलझाने की कोशिश करते हैं तो हमें ये दिखता है कि उसके जड़ में तो ज़मीन का विषय है। जब तक हम उसको हल नहीं करेंगे तब तक हम हिंसा से उसको कैसे दूर निकाल सकते हैं। तो और जब मैं वहाँ पे अध्ययन करी थी, मैंने एक और भी बहुत बड़ी महत्वपूर्ण चीज़ देखी, वो ये कि ये जो कस्टमरी राइट भी है, मेंटेनेंस का राइट, ये भी ओवर टाइम बहुत डिक्लाइन करा। एक समय था जबकि मेंटेनेंस राइट का मतलब होता था कि मेरे पति के वर्चस्व में जितनी ज़मीन है, अगर वो चला गया तो उसके जाने के बाद विधवा महिला को वो सारी ज़मीन के ऊपर मेंटेनेंस के ऊपर राइट होगा, वो उसको मैनेज करेगी। लेकिन फिर एक सेकंड फेज आया जबकि उसको वो सारी ज़मीन का हक नहीं दिया जाता था, केवल उतनी ज़मीन दी जाती थी जितनी कि उसके लिए ज़रूरी समझी जाए। कि अगर मैंने पति के पास ज़मीन मेरे 10 एकड़ था, जो भी रहा हूँ, पर इसके लिए समाज को लगता है कि 1 एकड़ ज़रूरी है तो उतनी ही दी जाएगी। लेकिन वर्तमान परिस्थितियों में उसको वो ज़मीन भी नहीं दी जाती, खाली समझा जाता है कि उसको खाली मेंटेनेंस के लिए रहना खाना चाहिए। एंड एवरीवन सिटिंग इन दिस रूम probably understand कि that maintenance doesn't come very respectful। तो इस सारी व्यवस्था में जब औरतों के अधिकार और उनका देखा जाना अपने आप में इतना कमज़ोर है कि वो चाहे रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हो, चाहे फॉरेस्ट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हो, चाहे होम स्टेट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हो, उनकी स्थिति हमेशा कमजोर ही रहती है।
Does the audience have any issue with what ma'am said in terms of understanding?
Quick summary would be useful, I think. There are a few
Okay. So, ma'am referred that there are certain innate practices. For instance, she is linking how we often understand violence being a very physical portion thing, but ma'am has went on to extend that often this happens in terms of pressurizing women with regard to the customary holding that she has over land. These practices need not be violent, need not be coerced, but they are very innate forms of violence that often women have to undergo with regard to the customary rights that she has over land. Understanding the fact that women in India are still, most part of India is still struggling to give formal ownership, land rights to women. So, in very short, this is what ma'am said. Very important points raised by ma'am. I think we often we look at violence from very force in terms of coerciveness, but then these are also very psychological parts of it. Some very important points raised. We'll move to Anuj. Anuj, you have conducted very extensive research in the western Rajasthan with regard to RE infrastructures there. With regard to your experience within RE, how do you look at customary technology rights, and how are these rights overlooked with regard to the current RE projects?
When we think of Western Rajasthan or Western Gujarat, what the first picture that comes into our mind is the desert. And desert has a certain semantic meaning, and that semantic has been used by the Indian state for long to capture that. And many of us may thinking that the desert is unproductive, there is no productivity, there is no biodiversity and everything. But what we found out, or what they want us to forward, is that there are people who are living in these areas. If the ecosystems are so unproductive, what these people are doing. And fortunately, the ecosystems have their own cycle, own productivity, and over the years, the community living in deserts has developed a symbiotic kind of relationship with these deserts. And that symbiotic kind of relationship in these desert ecosystems is not based on the formal land right, the formal ownership right. In fact, your formal ownership rights, I will say, they are temporary. So they will work only when there will be a rainy season between say July to October, when you will be actually farming your own field. But once the farming season is over, for the rest of the 9 months, all of these farms are used as common rather than as a private land. Now, in this sense, your use rights become far more important for your value, for your survival, and which has been within the culture. Now, who are the users? So it is really not important who are the owners of the land, but the most of the livelihood in the ecosystem depends on the users of the land. Now, who are the users? The users. These are pastoral communities who depend for fodder and the other fodder, water and other things on the common as well as on the private land. And when I am saying common, we should keep in mind that private land, de facto it would be owned by the private entity or the private individual, but de jure, but de facto it is used as a common land. Okay, for most of the year. Now, what we are doing that when there is a early transition happening in the desert ecosystem, we are converting the temporary ownership of the land, the temporary private use rights of the land into a permanent use rights of the land. The moment I shift from temporary 3-month use right to a 12-month permanent use right, both on the private and the common land, all other users of the land of the land of the community without it, but actually has been siphoned off. All these uses has been destroyed over the time. Now, who is getting impacted? One, the pastoral community is an obvious answer. But who are the petrol communities? The petrol communities are usually Dalit, usually come from a socio-economic background, caste and community group, and also women. Now, how and when I say women, I am talking about the women not only from the Dalit community but also from the women in the upper caste community. They go to these commons to collect firewood, to collect non-timber forest products from any tree, and they use it. It gives them a time outside the gauge of the patriarchal structure within their family, but also give them some kind of a financial security because they control the health in the house, they have a control over the produce they have collected from the common. And ultimately what happens is when we are transitioning from this in these regions where your use right from more important to a permanent formal title to the RE project, whether compensated or not compensated, they are ultimately going to affect the biggest portion of society, which includes women, Dalits and the other communities. And that can assault of having infrastructure on these communities in the absence of any formal recognition of rights and the formal compensation mechanism.
Thank you. So very interesting points. We'll come to which again. We'll move to Professor Rao. As Himanshu was also mentioning how Supreme Court judgments have been called here and there with regard to recognition of customary rights. My question to you is, because you have worked in Northeast and you work extensively on customary law, what are the challenges today at legal level or for legal processes to give recognition to these rights? Please speak about it.
See, land, I think it's one of the biggest assets of any nation. Obviously, without land, we do not have a nation as such. Customarily, we have this land in the form of a reed nuts, no man's land, in the olden days. Whoever comes first, we provide it. And then we say, okay, from here to there, that's my land. Slowly, as civilization progresses, we have the society. From society, we have the kingdoms. And from kingdom today, we have a formal system of government that we have. As I take for example, today when we walk in here, I sat on that chair, right, which is occupied by you. Now, if I have to live here permanently in this room, I will assert on you with all my force. That may go violent as well. Similarly, when society develops, power grows. And as we are humans, we are emotionally weak. And therefore, power becomes our weakness. And therefore, we try to assert. And that's how, when government develops, government is just an association of humans which impose power upon the subjects. So that in the territorial limits, the subjects remain within that particular association of government. So with that, slowly, in the United States, from the re-knowledge land, battleship, the grow registration process. So in order to assert my right legally, registration process started. That alienated a large portion of the Indian nations into a foreign land. Similarly, in India also, we have our own traditional customary battleship, which was not in records. We say कि यहाँ से यहाँ जो है ये हमारा ज़मीन है, वहाँ से वहाँ है वो आपका ज़मीन है. We can say that. So when the colonial rulers started, we slowly adopted those methods of registration. Registration is just a process so that the government establishes its complete control over the land of its subjects. Once registration is done, you are subjected to the law of the state. That means you are submitting yourself. I may have a marriage with her, but if I don't get my marriage registered, the government is no one to say. I may have a dispute with him, but unless I go to the court of law or take it to the authority has nothing to say. We may dare ourselves, right? So that's where we allow the state to interfere in our own rights. But in that process, we are talking about customary now in the modern scenario. Customary, we only refer to the tribal sections or the scheduled caste sections, etc. Customary also refers to the, to the higher sections of the society as well. They also have their own customs. They also have the same plot of land in the same nation. And therefore, the context of customary should not be restricted only to the tribal. It should be applied equally as well to the higher sections of the society. Right? So, if I remember internationally, in Australia, the Queensland case, the Marco versus the Queensland case, the Supreme Court of Australia has clearly said that a state act, that means a state legislation, cannot do away with the traditional rights of that. That movement is still going on. Similarly, in India, Sir said, Supreme Court is to some extent, changing his opinion depending upon the nature of the case. In some cases, the Supreme Court assert to the original traditional rights. But in some cases, the Supreme Court favors the eminent domain rather than the traditional customary rights. As for example, if we go to the Chutanakul Breju's case, that was long time back in the 60s. The Supreme Court has clearly said that we will not interfere with the traditional customs in the Chutanakul Breju. But today, when we come to the environmental context case, when the Supreme Court looks from an environmental context case, the Supreme Court, on the principle of sustainable development, make alternative arrangements and eliminate the tribal population space from their, indigenous inhabitant area and rehabilitate to a somewhere between area. Right? So the Supreme Court looks those cases from different angles, and therefore sometimes it is very difficult to generalize what opinion is in the mind of the Honorable Supreme Court. Now again, for example, if we go into the Jaipur Development Authority case, the Supreme Court has clearly said that you cannot take away an individual land because that is his traditional right. And even though we have amended, repealed the right to property under the fundamental right, but still it is a constitutional and a legal right, and therefore you cannot just throw away somebody from the land. So the Supreme Court keeps on changing the judgments depending upon the context in which it is challenged. First one. And that is what is very important in litigation, that when you challenge a case in the court of law, the foundation is very important, because the court will only frame 2 or 3, cause of actions, issues, and actually get upon it. Because the court will only listen to what you argue. The court cannot bring in something from here or something from there. It is what you argue. And therefore, I always advise when you go for litigation, you choose the right lawyer, you discuss what subject you have to challenge. If you challenge in the wrong direction, the Supreme Court will give a wrong order, and your cause will be lost in the process. And that is how I think in that way I will answer your question, because I don't want to take much time because it will keep on explaining. Legal thing is a very big issue. Yeah, next question.
Thank you, sir. I think some very precise on these points. We'll move from what customary tenure rights mean to giving it a more structural recognition. And so we'll start with Anuj this time. Anuj, you were talking about how the various ways in which RE infrastructures have neglected customary tenure rights. And in that case, how do we move beyond a monitoring model for the implementation of customary tenure rights within RE, and can we secure an alternative livelihood for these displaced communities?
So coming to that, for tribal, I will try to victim, I case of the army. In India, we never had a justified land acquisition reform. The land has been taken over by the state for development and industrial development law. But then, why we are discussing army and what makes army so different? And one of the things which army makes so different is that multi-type sector is very less. So even like when we were building, say, steel plants in Odisha or steel plants in Bengal, the large number of the people have been excluded from their land. And they have never been compensated fairly, right? But when these kind of steel plants or very large industrial plants are coming, they also come up with a large informal economy which parallelly develop along with these plants. Although you don't, the state is not compensating them, whatever we can say, that is not justified at all. But at least those industries used to offer some equated to absorb these alienated farmers who have been alienated from the use of the land. While in the case of the army, what happened, because it does not offer same kind of the multi-type sector, there are very less opportunities to absorb the people or absorb the users of the land who have been alienated from their use of the land. And that's when the problem becomes more acute in the case of the army in comparison to the other government. Now, what would be if the compensatory mode, the financial compensation is enough or not, or whether it is possible or not, I am not going to go into debate. What I see with the RE, while I have chosen a particular model with the RE, but the RE also offers certain ways where a coexistence kind of thing can happen in the case of the desert. So like in one of our fields where we found that one of the companies which are running in the large plant, they have provided grading cards. So like festival communities who had the grading card can go into a certain part of the plant and allow their community, allow them to actually grade over the plant. Actually, it will help the army plant. The army plant anyway has to spend their money to cut the guard because ultimately if guard goes larger, your panels will be under the guard and after one point of time you have to create the guard. But and then you throw it away. So you have to spend a lot of money, lot of manpower in doing so, but you can do it for free if you allow you can do it. The second could be a mechanism where if that is what is the role of the panchayat. And that role of panchayat would be very important in institutionalizing that kind of a mechanism. Unfortunately, under the current formal legal system, the RE has given a free run in the name of green energy, sustainability, and go down. And because of that, there is no regulation. The one of the casualty of this approach is our local government institutions like panchayat. The panchayat are nowhere in the loop, even with the large area parks such as in Gujarat we can talk about where in Gujarat and in Rajasthan, Badla and other parts. The local panchayats have no power to regulate it. While if a legal mechanism can be established, the local panchayat can become the formal forum to negotiate between the community and the RE company. And it is not that the RE companies can circumvent the local politics completely, they cannot. Because of many conflicts on the land or the using of the land, they have to go through the informal mechanism to make sure that there are no conflicts and their projects are not getting built. They have to spend large amount of the money on these informal networks and mechanisms. So yes, if we can find the mechanism of the synergy between the users of the land and the RE project development. The second is the strengthening the role of the local panchayat in renewable energy development could be one idea which can promote development of the renewable energy infrastructure with having a lead cost to the local communities or a kind of coexistence or a symbiotic relationship which has developed over centuries. So I would argue that rather than imposing our infrastructure and putting it and just clearing the land and putting our infrastructure, it would have been a better approach if we leave the our infrastructure within the symbiotic relationship between the community and the land, which has got developed in prayer over.
Thank you, Anil. I think these are very interesting points and something to also keep in mind with regard to what we have been working, particularly within large area infrastructure and in festival Rajasthan. We'll come to Shipra ma'am. In your previous conversation, you were outlining how there are innate practices of violence which is often related to women and men. I want to understand how do then women, you're looking at women as a very homogeneous category here, but then how come women as a community often negotiate a recognition of these non-technical? Has there been any place, any case study, anything that you can recall? I mean, what are the minor mechanisms in which women can contest or can negotiate their land ownership? Any successful cases?
I think in all these scenarios, and in most of the scenarios where women's rights are kind of compressed, I think collective functioning is one way for women to struggle to move beyond it and to overcome all these challenges. Wherever I see some success that women have achieved in claiming their rights, in being able to do better negotiation, it is through the collectives. Because these collectives provides them a safe space, number one, to come together, to discuss, and then they build on each other's energy to negotiate. And it's true in negotiation with the government, with the officials, but also with the customary leaders and within families itself. There have been examples in Odisha, and there are in Odisha, in Jharkhand, in Telangana, and there have been organizations that have been facilitating women's collective strengths, for example, TDS in Andhra, Sundarai, Odisha, Udan in Jharkhand, in Madhya Pradesh. And whenever women come together, they are able to negotiate better with the government officials, and they also often step into the terrain where women have traditionally not been into. For example, when it comes to forest rights, traditionally the participation in the forest management committees, etc., was considered to be very strong. But after this FRA came into place and women have been provided participation into the forest management committees, many women have come together to negotiate with the government officials, and they have done mapping of the resources, they have done survey of landless communities or people who need things. But I think here I have cited a very intriguing story which I heard from a group of women in Jharkhand. So there was this woman called Julia who belongs to the Santhal side, and when she got married, her husband passed away, leaving with her just one daughter who was 1 year old. So after her husband passed away, nobody in her marital family wanted her to stay in the marital family because she would then be the claimant of the family wealth. So she came back to her parents' house. Now the tradition is that once the daughter has come to the tradition of the marital family, would invite her to come back. But this did not happen for Julia, so she did not go back. So a year later, her mother took her with her and brought her to her marital family, but she was not invited there. She suffered a lot of violence. She wasn't able to eat. She became very weak. Her daughter also lost her health, so she came back to her parents' family. Now in her parents' family, she did not have a brother, but she had these male cousins who did not want her to stay in her parents' home, because when she is married and she is somewhere else, then her parents will belong to the cousins. But if she is there, then her parents will belong to the male cousins. So her male cousins also started humiliating her a lot. And in the meantime, her mother passed away, her father passed away. And when her father passed away later, and when her father passed away, her male cousins started saying कि पहले ये जमीन हमारे नाम करो, तब हम तुम्हारे पिता का लास्ट राइट करेंगे, because traditionally a woman cannot do the last rites of the parents. Now this woman, she was not a member of any women's collective, but within that village and in the nearby villages, there was this Ekal Nari Shakti Sangathan, which is like single women's collective. So women of these collectives came to know that there is a woman there who is struggling like this, and these men in her family are not allowing her to cremate, and they are saying that she should first transfer the land rights to the male cousins and then only the women. So this group of women, they themselves approached them, and they gave her the courage. They said कि वो नहीं कर रहे तो तुम खुद कर सकती हो. But by herself, that woman would never have the courage कि मैं खुद ही जाके मेरे father का cremation कर लूँ. But when that collective came together, it gave her the courage to do the cremation and in turn keep the land, preserve her land rights. So that's how all of this is so complex. It's not just very linear always the right है या नहीं है, and that's how I think then this one particular instance just shows me the power of women collectives and how it helps negotiate within families, it helps negotiate the cultural norms, it helps negotiate with the state, and in turn get better rights and better position.
I think over recent years we have seen how collective action from the marginalized communities have made some impact on various dimensions. So, so we'll move with Professor Abul's time. So you were referring how, with regard to legal jurisprudence and to go about legal processes, we need to have right remarks also from the Supreme Court. But I believe in the recent years there have been some dissonance with regard to the recognition of customary tenure rights. So can you talk about any recent judgment in India or elsewhere? Or what are the legal processes that we can adopt today which can give more recognition to the customary tenure rights? Something from the, let's say, last 10 years can reflect on.
When you say customary tenure in cases of the Supreme Court, in the context of the Supreme Court will go on a specific legislation that we make an issue before on the Supreme Court. That happens in mostly of the northeastern states and the hillside areas. And in the rest of the nation, people do not consider the ownership as a customary right, maybe because of the caste system or maybe of the higher society thing. That's a different thing which legislation in a social context has to be changed. In that case, regarding the question, I believe that Supreme Court has been consistently recognizing the customs so far as we challenge, but subject to the eminent domain. Obviously, we live in a nation, and for economic coordination of the nation, since we are in a federation, it is very important that the eminent domain prevails over the rest of the fundamental rights that we have, irrespective of the customs that we have. Customs, as says in the Constitution, we mostly refer to Article 13 of the Constitution and Article 29, Clause 1. Other than that, we have no such codified law, because customs cannot be codified. The moment you codify customs, then that is the end of one traditional civilization. So, in order to bring in line with the formal system the government started registration process. The government tried to make a code on customs regarding various rights that includes land as well. But still there remains some system which cannot be covered by a codified law. Right? As for example, on what Man was talking about under the Hindu law, it's a personal law. Custom has been codified and right has been given to one. But there are still some other smaller sections of the society in India where customs cannot be codified and society cannot accept such a law which can be in par with the rest of the society. Right? As for example, you will find it, I'm taking the example of the Sultanapur areas, women still do not have a right of property, they cannot inherit northeastern states, except Meghalaya, the rest of the states, women cannot inherit, etc., etc. And the Supreme Court in such matters cannot interfere because that is a social issue. And if Supreme Court tries to bring in strictly the fundamental rights on it and make it par with the rest of the fundamental rights, then it will create a social chaos. And the Supreme Court obviously would not like to create a social chaos because of this judgment that we have seen recently in Manipur. The High Court judgment has sparked, has created fire in the state, which is a serious matter, even till unable to resolve. Right? So, custom as such should be left alone. Right? Let the society handle it. Bringing in a codified legislation or the Supreme Court, adversely coming into the picture will obviously affect society. Judiciary as such is blind. So judiciary will only go on the line where the lawyers argue. Judiciary, even though the judge might be aware of the force surrounding, but he will not bring in those force surrounding. He will argue or he will give a judgment on the argument what the lawyer says. And that is how where customs as such, therefore the framers of our constitution were very careful. And therefore in Article 13 of the constitution, we have only made that only those customs that are violative of Part 3 of the constitution, which is the fundamental rights of the constitution, will be ultra vires to that extent. And therefore, all the customs remain valid unless they are contrary to the fundamental rights. And therefore, the customs will go on. So, I have quoted the judgment of the Mahfouz case of the Australian Supreme Court. And I think in India also that goes well because it is already a constitutionally settled matter that to what extent the customs are valid and to what extent the customs are not valid. So I think the matter is there.
Some very important questions. We'll come finally to Professor Himanshu. So I want, so particularly let's say from governance and policy framework, what changes do you feel can be made, particularly with regard to the current scenario keeping in mind, in order to give recognition to these customary gender roles? I mean, particularly from the governance and policy framework.
Before we come to the recognition of traditionally established access rights, which I quoted from the case, which was prior to FR. And I believe in part the kind of violent evictions, even for traditionally established access rights holder, the transient bishop of community, although well documented by the Kashraj of this wonderful function, everybody is going to enjoy the moon and the net. Partly, although those transient bishop didn't bring the justice in the case, paved the way for Indian Parliament to recognize that there are forest dwellers who have been inhabiting forests, who have been cultivating the forest. And again, environmental history, we have to draw from academic resources also, correct? You look at David Hardiman's work in the dams in Gujarat, his paper is called The Farming in the Forest. And so forest bureaucracy will have to start reading environmental history a bit. They cannot just look at revenue records and live in the era of British colonial forest governance. That paved the way for Indian Parliament to say that there has been historical injustice. We want to give and recognize who are there to give. The language, if you read the preamble of FRA 2006 is that these rights have existed and they have carried on cultivation. So those rights are hereby recognized and they laid down a process by which the FRA implementation will take place. Now it's anyone's guess from 2006, 20 years later, where are we? But the kind of violent evictions that we used to see in forest land in the name of clearing enforcements that we saw in 2002, we haven't seen in the last 20 years. So that has been happening. Having said that, there has also been landslide. We have gone 2 steps ahead, 4 steps backward, as the revolution was in Gujarat. Why am I saying that? We have in India a working constitution, under which we have established constitutional institutions. So in India, there is a constitutional institution called the CAG of India, which can undertake a performance audit of 100 land acquisition cases in Odisha, specifically in Schedule 6 area. Right? So Scheduled area gives the protection. Land acquisition process in a scheduled area will not happen the same way in a non-scheduled area. Gram Sabha's consent is an inevitable step before which the collector cannot declare a war, cannot start disputing the compensation. The land acquisition shall not move onwards. Look at the audit report that has been in public domain by the CAG of India. Odisha's assembly got it tabled on 11 September 2024. I looked at this audit report last year when I was doing a field work in one of the mining affected districts in Odisha. And to my point, even when the record of Gram Sabha clearly had suggested that people resolved that they will not let 1 inch of the land go for the mining expansion, the land acquisition still matters. So that's a violation. And when a constitutionally established, globally, who are the institutions like CAG of India Court, they are called Supreme Court institutions. There is a lot of work that exists in media and academia on Supreme Court, but we need to do equally important work on what happens to CAG of Court. Once they are tabled in Parliament, once they are tabled in Assembly. And what have been some consequences after that September 11, 2024 report, which is in public domain? Public Accounts Committee should have taken cognizance by now. It has been more than a year now. Zero. Heads must roll. I mean, the district collector has neglected his constitutional duty that this nation imposed on him of upholding the constitutionally established rights of the tribals of Odisha. And what has happened to the country? What has happened to the revenue sector? So, we have gone 2 steps ahead. As I said in FRA, we would not see that sort of violent evictions that used to happen in 2002. But again, in FRA again, the Supreme Court now and then keeps hearing the matter. And this kind of reports, when they enter public domain, they were looking at the files in Sundargarh. And they asked the revenue office and district collector's office that where are the records of these 26 cases of land acquisition. The reply that has gone on record in the CAG audit report is a reply where the executive agency said the records are missing. That is a reply on record. So, the kind of praise and undermining of certain constitutional institutions that we have seen in recent times, correct, should alarm us to again understand that if India has to develop to the Viksit Bharat stage in 2027, better we look back at what was the vision of the framework of our constitution, how they gave us people this republic, and we must assert the independence of constitutional institutions and their recommendations. That executive must follow the recommendations of constitutional institutions in specific CAG of India.
I think these are very common institutional gaps that are important. I want to stay with you and actually build on this argument. I think one of the problems with recognition of these customary rights is also how do we quantify it, how do we measure it. So regard to that, what are the alternative frameworks that you can suggest from policy and governance level, which can bring about a recognition or some, or at least address these logistical challenges of quantifying these rights or
Someone very profoundly says that everything that matters cannot be measured, and everything that can be measured cannot be things that matters in society. Okay, so there are certain things that would not lend itself to the quantification and statistics. For example, before India's Green Revolution, there existed a symbiotic relationality that gets captured beautifully in the song in the film Matches by Muzar. When those young guys go, what is the song that is being sung? And there is a Himachali pastoral guy who is with this landed youth of Punjab. And what is the chemistry there? What does it talk about? Before India's Green Revolution, farmers, cattle cultivators used to welcome pastoral herds because those herds brought fertilizer. We didn't have chemical fertilizers. And that relationality, there was not written contracts. The village sarpanch didn't say this, that this from Himachal would be welcome. This is not traditionally established land relationality. Some land use would happen when the land is fallow. The goats will come, they will graze, they will go away. The pastoral herd will move on its, and that used to happen in this part of the world, in Western India. For example, herds will move from Rajasthan, will come to Madhya Pradesh. Sometime in 1980s, there this relationality broke down because the political economy of settled cultivation changed, the cropping patterns changed, the Green Revolution had come along. So by 1980s, what do you see? That the forest department of Madhya Pradesh is also saying no, these herds cannot enter the forest because reserve forest, we cannot allow herds to enter and graze. The settled cultivators of Madhya Pradesh also started being violent, and there is violent conflict. So one is not painting a very rosy picture of symbiotic relationality between different groups. But if you look at pastoral people in India, what is it that they are asking us to recognize? Long back in the case of Dunlop versus Gram Panchayat in Goa, one specific community in the village was demanding that the passage that we had, where we used to move our herd, has been taken over because the Dunlop has built a compound wall. And I have to negotiate now a large, and that's not what my herd is used to. This has been a traditional path that I have moved. And I must be given access back to the traditional path. He is not demanding 24/7, 365 days land rights. He is not asking that he will cultivate the piece of that land on which the company exists. But he has the memory of using that path. In Himachal, now with a technology changing, there is an effort. I must congratulate my colleagues in psychopastoralism, which is a research intensive. Now with technology and trading behavior, the paths can be there on the map. And so the certain things that can lend itself to speciality now must be recognized. And negotiations will have to start, which is what the psychopastoralism is doing with Himachal Pradesh Forest Department. And similar things can happen in Rajasthan, similar things can happen in Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh. This usage rights, foraging, usufruct rights, right? People have this very weird understanding of looking at land rights only as land titles and the imagination of settled culture. That was something that we were locked into when late British colonial era only looked at settled cultivator and looked at within settled cultivator someone who grew cotton as the progressive farmer. But we need to come out of that era and we need to recognize that there are veterans. So for example, just with this last example of a Tamil Nadu record judgment, there was an SEZ case which PUCL was fighting against with the village communities. I could say we must compensate, but how did HICORT compensate it? The pastoral people who used to take their herds to this land for grazing, and there used to be water commons also, there were wetlands. 7 villages depended on that wetland in one SEZ. I could say, in order to compensate, we will hereby direct the Animal Husbandry Department of Tamil Nadu state to cultivate fodder in a land of this much acre. Correct? So, sometimes when in legal jurisprudence compensation mechanism comes in, again there is a very weird understanding of not understanding what is pastoral mobility and what is open grazing foraging animals. Correct? It's sometimes you would see again these lands of saying that store-fed animals is the mainstay, and so we will make sure that there is some fodder that is coming from somewhere. So the cultivated fodder, and again when compensating mechanism comes, that's why I said everything that is measured cannot be the earnings of better, and so we need to go beyond some of these traditional methods. How do you establish what has been existing there as a land right, which is not a settled cultivation oriented land rights? Use of that rights has to be recognized. Use the right of passage, and right of passage becomes very important issue. Correct? People say linear projects do not do violence. When you are looking at linear projects not doing violence, you are not recognizing that some of these highways and linear projects that you are talking about actually are cutting the same traditionally established access rights on that piece of land that we are saying, not a large scale displacement, not thousands of acres, but for that herd, for that nomad, what does it mean? What does this? We have this expressway between Baroda and Ahmedabad. What it could have done to several farmers who still have to go to their farm in the Puram Park because they have not been able to buy a tractor. But do society ask this question? Do project developers of that want to go to Viksit Bharat of 2047 ask this question?
I want Anuj to actually also build on the lesson functions argument, because of specific reference to the renewable energy sector. How can we then imagine the compensation mechanisms which Professor Himanshu was mentioning? How would they look like, and would it be any different with specific reference to our users?
Look area according to which has been done in India, which has been done. I would say more difficult, but something was there in terms of the compensation goes to the owners of the land and the users. Unfortunately, or like very cleverly, the government has bypassed the legislation. In the case of the RV, because in RV there is no land activity connected. They are not causing activity. Now, if you are not acquiring land for anything, then you are not actually, when you are not acquiring, you don't need to compensate anybody. And that the biggest model which has become the mainstay of RE for transportation. Now, one of the things which I believe that this is a two-part problem. One is the agential problem. The many of the users are politically, economically, and socially with them. Even if Mr. Mao and Mr. Manju and rightly said that even if we give them some legal rights, whether they are enough empowered to implement, to ask for the implementation of those legal rights or not. That's the first question. And I completely agree with Mr. Mao and Mr. Manju that despite having laws, there are brutal violation of law, even in the case of the recorded history. But at least they will come there. At least they will come recorded history. At least there are some ways where somebody has an agency can challenge them. But in the case of the RV, we do not have that at all. We cannot. I don't know means like how to challenge a land use case in the case of the RV, because On the paper, no law has been violated. You don't require environmental law. There are no environmental laws applicable, there are no social laws applicable, there are no ecological, there are no other, there are no political laws are applicable on this. And if no law is applicable, then as Professor Martin was out in front of the people. Okay? So the one thing is that actually even despite of redundancy and the weakness of the current legal system in the case of development project, those laws should be extended to one thing. And then there needs to be some form of the agency building of these communities so that they can demand those duties now. Third thing that technology can become really important as a of living data. That it's not true that the state do the data. Who is using the they do the land revenue survey. The land revenue survey are ultimately who own the land. Some parts like a broad classification of the use of the land, but they are very broad, not like actually what are actually used. Can we use technology now to understand that what kind of uses are actually there on the ground, and can those uses symbiotically included within the RV infrastructure? There could be some kind of the mechanism which are not necessarily a financial compensation mechanism, but a non-financial compensation mechanism, which can include users, which can include within the within this ecosystem to make sure that their rights are not going to work. In that scenario, I feel that the panchayat, like they have played an important role both in FRA and giving consent to the developmental project, or not giving consent to the developmental project. Similar kind of role these local panchayats can play. Although I do recognize that the panchayat in tribal areas are very different panchayats in the non-tribal areas. Panchayats in tribal areas are more of that have horizontal power structure, but there we have vertical power structure and how they will play out the aggregation. But at least there can be some inches of the rolling of the ball, if possible, if we bring those kind of issues within the legal and the institutional mechanism to around criminal.
Carrying this argument of your attention, and it comes to Shipra ma'am from while I think there are talks among the panelists about how panchayat can play a very important role in the institution building, we know how women have also been, I mean, we forget how women are marginalized in these various spaces as well, with regard to whether they are sitting on village councils, even if they are the sarpanches, we have how the male counterpart, the male husbands who basically run the governments. So in that regard, how can women as a community, I mean, how do we then look at agency and institutional challenges, and what are the frameworks should women then work through to give, to have a more recognition of their user rights and
मुझे लगता है जो मेन स्ट्रीम थिंकिंग रही है ना लैंड के अराउंड कि लैंड बिलोंग्स टू द हाउस होल्ड, और हम सोचते रहे हैं कि एक हाउस होल्ड के अंदर जितने भी लोग हैं उन सबके इंटरेस्ट एक जैसे होते हैं, दिस इज नॉट ट्रू कि एक परिवार की ज़मीन है तो सबके इंटरेस्ट आर टेकन केयर ऑफ, ये सच नहीं है। उसके अंदर बहुत सारे इंट्रा डायनेमिक्स होते हैं और मेन वुमेन डायनेमिक्स बहुत प्रोनाउंस्ड होते हैं जिसके अंदर। तो मुझे लगता है जो फेमिनिस्ट जूरिस्प्रूडेंस है, हम क्या देखते हैं, हम फेमिनिस्ट जूरिस्प्रूडेंस ये देखता है कि व्हाट इज हैपनिंग टू ईच एंड एवरी वुमेन लिविंग, व्हाट्स हैपनिंग टू डिफरेंट kinds of women, what is their lived reality. Land is not just a lifeless asset, but it's a lived reality, it's a relational context. The relation that I have with a piece of land versus the relation which a tribal woman would have or a pastoralist woman would have might be different. So, the feminist jurisprudence suggests that all of these are these need to be seen in the context of the lived reality. बात करते हैं तो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल राइट टू इक्वालिटी, राइट टू डिग्निटी, हाउ डू दे इंटरसेक्ट विद कस्टम्स एंड ट्रेडिशंस? जो हम जिस केओस को बचाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, केओस नहीं, ऐसा तो नहीं कि ऑटो के आंसुओं पे खड़ा हुआ है, वो शांति होने लग रही है। तो उस सब चीज़ को देखने की ज़रूरत है, सो दैट ईच एंड एवरी इंडिविजुअल ह्यूमन, सिंगल है, ट्राइबल है, दिल्ली में बैठी है या फिर झारखंड के किसी गुंडा में बैठी है, बट ईच एंड एवरी वन हैज दैट राइट टू लिव विद डिग्निटी। उसके लिए लॉ में क्या एडजस्टमेंट किया जाना जरूरी है, क्या FRA में क्या किया जाना जरूरी है, रेवेन्यू लॉ में क्या किया जाना जरूरी है। जब हम इन चीज़ों को नहीं देखते होकर तो जो कानून की भाषा है वो भी पेट्रियार्कल है, जो कानून के प्रोविजंस हैं उसमें भी वो गैप्स है, क्योंकि हम ट्रेडिशनली बस यही सोचते रहे हैं कि मैन इज द लैंड होल्डर, वही जमीन टिलर है, लैंड टिलर हैज बीन द टैगलाइन ऑफ all the land redistribution and land reforms that were carried out. But feminist thinking helps us think beyond this in context of the lived realities, and I think lived realities are what matter more to people who are alive. So उस तरह मुझे लगता है कि वही एक तरीका है कि हम सब चीज़ों को लोगों के हित में एडजस्ट कर पाए, क्योंकि पॉलिसी ज़्यादा ज़रूरी है या लॉ ज़्यादा ज़रूरी है या लोग और लोगों की रोज जी जाने वाली ज़रूरी, उसके लिए जो ज़रूरी है वो एडजस्टमेंट लॉ और पॉलिसी में होनी चाहिए।
For the sake of the audience, ma'am is saying that there must be an adjustment in feminist jurisprudence to acknowledge women's land rights. And I think I'll close then the discussion, at least from my side, because all the three panelists are saying how laws needs to be extended. So I'll come finally to Professor Rao, I mean, with regard to how everyone out there saying that yes, laws need to be extended. And let's, if you go beyond LAR 2013, what are the fundamental shifts required for legal jurisprudence to allow
Compensation is not the issue, because you cannot compensate your rights. It is impossible to compensate your traditional or your cultural rights. It's not like शोले, तो शोले मूवी था ना, आते तो काटते और वो compensate हो गया, वैसा नहीं होता है असली में. So it is impossible. So we cannot sell. In other words, we cannot sell our traditional rights to the government or to any other authority. See, government also goes for some other authorities. So we cannot sell our traditional rights to a private entity or even to a government entity. Oh, okay, we can do it for the security of the nation. That's a different issue. And therefore, when it comes to compensation as such, then it is only for the security and national interest. The rest, we cannot sell our rights. Right? Now, I'll just give you an example of which is not customary, but which is general, right? The limit, practical. Sir, आपके कैंपस के adjoining में एक society है, Dayal society या, right? That society है. That was a land which was taken from GNU campus, and then there are some GNU professors involved in it. और society बनाया अच्छा से लंबा का मंजिल का घर का society बनाया. Similarly, in Delhi University, adjoining to the Delhi University, there was a plot of land which was given to the metro for public purposes. So all these lands, both lands, were converted from the public purpose lands into housing societies. Right? The EU, we fought it because we do not want a high-rise building adjoining the campus, because it will destroy the beauty of the campus, number one. It will bring a lot of population, etc. We fight for almost 6-7 years, and finally we go. Secondly, when it comes to your society, the society owned the matter is the Supreme Court gave a judgment after almost 15 years that okay, now it is a properly allotted land. Now the difference is that a public land being converted. In Delhi University, we won in favor of the university, but in the GNU case, GNU lost the land. And in that, I will not name it, one prominent legal personality is involved in all this. That's the reason, right? उनका घर GNU कैंपस में था तो उनका जीत गया और वो वहाँ प्रोफेसर है तो जीत गया, ठीक है ना? वैसा है, the legal system is not good. But and therefore, the legal system in India is quite flexible. It can be turned this side and that side as well. Similarly, when it comes to our cultural rights, traditional rights, चाहे वो आप पंचायत करो या चाहे वो ग्राम सभा करो, that can, it's not a written law, and therefore tradition can be molded according to the person in the chair. Right? If I remember again another one case, the Nemgari's case, the Orissa mining wala case. After a long debate, the Supreme Court said that the village panchayat, the Gram Sabha, is the primary authority to decide who is the owner of the land, who has the right over the land. And now I do not know what the Gram Sabha has done it. The moment even the Supreme Court gives an authority to the Gram Sabha, the management becomes a little different. Now, we cannot blame the legislation as well, we cannot blame the administration as well in such a situation. There are middle persons involved in it. Right? There are middle persons who are playing in the middle. But these middle persons neither comes into the eye of the law or neither come under the eye of the bureaucracy. And that middleman may be me also, or several. Right? And that is where we need to be careful in coming to a conclusion of asserting what our right is. But as an activist or as a dutiful citizen, I will always assert that our traditional rights, which is granted by the Constitution, protected under Article 29 and 13 of the Constitution, cannot be solved at any cost. Compensation is amongst the same. That's it.
We'll open the floor to the audience. We just tend to have 5 to 10
Sorry,
minutes. Yeah,
sure.
sure.
How would we completely supporting this, but we have to be judgment. Actually, the judgment had to be carried out because the operational part of the judgment saying that Odisha High Court has to appoint district level judges to oversee the Gram Sabha proceedings. Gram Sabhas happened in all the 12 Gram Sabhas, and the outcome was square by zero. Because people said that Niyamgiri is a separate board, it's not just a mountain beneath which there is a bauxite that this company wants to do. This is our cultural belief. And that's what the Supreme Court would also say. Supreme Court said FRA grants not just individual rights, collective forest rights, there is a third right, which is the cultural right. And who is the arbitrator whether that cultural right holds? It's the Gram Sabha, it's not us. So the man must go to the Gram Sabha, that was the reason. I have taken more than half minutes.
That's not a problem. We can take 2 so ma'am.
Yeah, my question is, in relation to Rajasthan, and I think you also mentioned this, this issue of wasteland category is critical. And in a sense, the government has almost full authority over how those allocations can be, given to the private sector, whereas there's lots of customary rights being held over that type of land. And as you said, panchayats don't really have any role in all of this. And I think what's missing here is a kind of consideration of who are the custodians of customary tenure in terms of governance system. So Gram Sabha is just a formal elected body, but there must be others who are in some sort of leadership role and consideration for take place. But so I was just curious what your experience has been in terms of the wastelands and really, we know that there's a kind of debate about whether this has to be useful or not. What have you seen in terms of actually how negotiations have occurred over land which is in the wastelands?
I total answer right. India has a population around 18% of the world, and we have a 2.7% of land. So in such a country, there is not even an inch of them which can be built. If I go into a little history of the wasteland, the term wasteland is started appearing in Indian laws somewhere around 1790s, and how the term has started using it, what is the waste? The waste was in the manner that is not generating enough revenue. It has nothing to do with the ecological productivity. Unfortunately, the year 1947, we have continued this category called wasteland. And I can give you an example of Tamil Nadu. In late 60s and 70s, the wasteland in Tamil Nadu has been converted into greenland with a particular variety of which we call Videti bamboo in India. I forgot the botanical name. And, just wait. And the same wasteland, which had been converted into a greenland in 1970s, has remained wasteland on the paper, and in 2006-2007, that wasteland has been again allotted to get to clear up and produce jatropha. Okay. So the wasteland as a category is not what the land productivity is, it's more about a legal mechanism to take over the common land which has been used for multiple years. We have a similar kind of experience in life in the case of the renewable energy, where government put a RE plant on saying it is a wasteland, it has no use, but actually there are thousands of users which are actually using that land for all kinds of uses. For petroleum, for cultivation, for collecting food, vegetable and other things. So they are very active ecosystems rather than just calling them wasteland.
Question in just
Thank you so much for the panel. It was very informative. My question is on just transitions policies. So, as you know, a lot of states are coming up with just transition task force, just transition policies, and the fundamental structure of just transitions framework is based on several dimensions of justice, including recognition justice, which does ask for recognition of a lot of customary rights as well. So do you think, does the panel think that there is any avenue or a potential within the just transitions policy work that's happening in providing recognition rights to customary rights as well? Secondly, in the state of Rajasthan, because I know some of you are doing work in Rajasthan, do you see any developments of just transitions work in the context of recognition of customary rights?
You rightly pointed out that there are several dimensions to the transition. Unfortunately, that all the dimensions do not get the equal weight. I see the one definitely three dimensions, but my question will be like justice for who? There can be a procedural justice, there can be a recognition justice, or substantive justice. But justice for who? What I feel is the power play is very important within the just transition system. Often, the communities which are not totally politically or financially empowered, they are largely ignored even within the transition framework in the name of efficiency, in the name of financial confidence and other things. And that's an unfortunate situation which I see in India, both in the renewable energy sector as well as in the traditional thermal power sector.